The secret of Paul's strength we find in Philippians 4:11 to 13. And, we got something coming up. All right. There are two secrets, and they seem to be a little bit of opposites, things contrary to themselves, and yet putting them together is the full secret of this. And the first one is his contentment. His contentment. Notice with me in Philippians 4:11 and 12. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. The apostle, verse that I have skipped here is verse 10, is just thanked the Philippian church for their loving care package. I don't know what all they sent. I don't know if it was money or things, warm clothing. I don't know. But Philippians 4:10, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, now that at last your care of me hath flourished again, or is revived, wherein you are also careful, but you lacked opportunity. It was perhaps this phrase, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. He particularly rejoiced, but he was rejoicing in the evidence of their loving care because he knew that was a thing of God. When you find people caring for others, that's a God thing. And especially since their gift was very difficult to send, being in prison at Rome. So now he wants to clarify his rejoicing. He's pointing out that his joy is not in the things that he received, even though the gift would be of great practical value to him. So he explains that by saying that his rejoicing was not in respect of want. The word want meaning lacking something. So Philippians 4:11a, not that I speak in respect of want. He says that the thing here is, I am not talking to you, praising you for this gift, because I want more stuff. I want more things. See, this is not a request for more things. He was to say later in Philippians 4:17, not because I desire a gift. It's not what I receive that I desire, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. I'm glad to see you doing something, an act of sacrificial love. That was what made him greatly rejoice. And then he explains to them that he was not in need. Now, in one sense he was, in sort of the normal sense, where we recognize that he was in prison, he wasn't able to work, he wasn't able to earn any money. But he says, my state of being is not one that is in need. And he points out that here, the Philippians supplied his needs in this case. Again, later he says in verse 18, but I have all, or I have received all. There was some list of what was supposed to be included, and he says, I checked it, and everything is there. And I abound. I have more than enough. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus. He was perhaps the very pastor of Ephesians, of the Philippi, that sent him that brought the gift to him. He says, received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell. This is a picture of the burning sacrifice. It smells like a barbecue. A sweet odor of a sweet smell. A sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God. So he says, in this case, you supplied my need, but God always supplies my need. So I do not exist as a person in need, you see. God supplied his need always. He explains this in verses 15 and 16. Now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated, fellowship, partnered with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica ye sent once and again unto my necessity. So he says, you have been a faithful supporter. And so you, knowing this, you, the church at Philippi, knowing this, recognize that God has his people all over, and that I do not exist in a state of need because my God is taking care of it all. Then he explains, and you could ask him that question, you say, you mean you're just depending on people to send something out of the blue, and that's okay with you? And because that was the only choice he had, he says, yes, yes. God is in control of this. So I'm quite happy with this situation. And then he reveals what he was expecting. In other words, with what was sent, did that meet his needs? And he says yes. So notice here the fact of contentment, the second part of verse 11. For I have learned in whatsoever state I am, whatever condition I am, therewith to be content. This is the key to this thing. He's not saying, I'm waiting for a standard of living, and you guys just haven't sent it yet, so keep on sending it until we reach that goal. See? I always kind of hated it when the church would have these goals, and I always felt like I wasn't doing enough, if everybody else wasn't doing enough, till we met the goal. And, if we had all voted and agreed on the goal of, buying the pool hall, or whatever it was, then we'd say, well, then we ought to back that, and so on. But I found very often it was the pastor who set the goal, and then God was appealed to as making sure that we got it done. At any rate, he said, I've just learned. So I want you to notice three things in this part. It's a learned skill. This does not automatically happen to you when you get saved. Since you were born and you learned to cry when you didn't have everything you wanted, we have, been the person who complained until we got what we wanted. That's the way the world teaches us and encourages us. He says, as a Christian, understanding the power of God over us, I have learned a different skill, and that is the skill of contentment. Then, because of that, he did not depend on human resources. He did not go to sleep worrying whether a shipment would come in tomorrow, see. It could, and it could not. And he was happy either way. He was content. And more than that, he was not just stoic. He was not just, well, maybe I was meant to starve, you see. But three, God met his needs. And he saw this overall. My wife and I learned this early in our marriage, not having much money at all. And there were times when we would invite some of our poor student friends over, and most often we chose spaghetti because it went a long way and didn't cost much to fix. And then there were some weeks where we just didn't have it to offer. And in those weeks, we'd be invited over for spaghetti. and we enjoyed the fellowship. But we got to where we understood that's just the way it worked. God was meeting the needs. I still like spaghetti, by the way. So a learned skill where you're not dependent on human resources. This isn't a frantic plea. And God met his needs. And God was so faithful in this, he didn't have any doubt. Now, I want you to notice the extent of contentment, because you and I tend to think of contentment of being satisfied with the status quo, about where we are. We're happy with that, and we think that's contentment. It's not really contentment. In verse 12, he says this, I know both how to be abased, put down, and I know how to abound, to have more than I need. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed. You hear all these terms of learning here. I am instructed to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Now, those are the boundaries, you see. And let me get into this a little bit. He had established, by what he had learned, he had an established financial plan. This is the way he thought about it. I know, I've learned this, how to be abased, how to exist in times when I have nothing coming in, and how to abound. Now, you say, well, great, you got more in there, you can spend more stuff. That's not how he worked. He was able to take things in more than he needed and save it. Somehow invest it. It might have been with a savings account, might have been in a bag under his bed. I don't know how he kept it. But it was guarded against the time when nothing was coming in. The general wisdom about if you choose to be an actor and you're struggling to be known, you have your job at the restaurant, you have your job at whatever you're doing, and you save half of everything that comes in. That's the general knowledge of how to do that, because there are times when you won't have anything coming in. So when something does come in, you save half of everything. So this is his financial plan. He says, I don't struggle with my hunger and then get bloated because I ate everything in sight when I got the money. See? He says, I have learned how to handle this. This was a financial plan. Then he says, his established willingness to adapt. He says things are not always the same. So everywhere and in all things, I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. We take this apart a little bit. I want you to notice his word, his instruction. I am instructed. I was quite interested to find out that this is a word that's used only here. That is specifically, I have been initiated into a secret. There was a series of cults, and later they would be known as the Gnostic cult. And Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. And the concept of this is that there is a secret knowledge. And if you join us and you're sworn to secrecy, then we will reveal the secret. You could be initiated into the secrets of our order. See? And this was supposed to be, the cure-all or something, whatever it was. He says, God initiated me into a secret of his being. So I have been initiated into this secret. And what is the secret? God's promise. God's promise. It's not something that's noticeable on the outward side. In verse 19, he's going to get back to this, and he says, but my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus. If you have somebody supplying your need who themselves doesn't have much, you say, well, they tried, it didn't work too well. But what if you have somebody who is as rich as God? And he says, I'll supply your need according to my riches. John Calvin says about verse 19, that the idea behind it is, do not think that you have impoverished yourself when you give your money to the Lord. Don't think that you've impoverished yourself. God, whom I serve, will abundantly furnish you with everything necessary for you. Let's emphasize then just for a moment, this thing of contentment is not about having what your neighbors have, or having what you used to have, or what you hope to have. All your need is defined in 1 Timothy 6:8. And having food, and this is the general word for sustenance, anything that you take in for nourishment, and raiment. This is the word literally for covering. Therefore, covering your shoulders with a coat, a shirt, and perhaps covering your head with a tent or a roof. Having food and raiment, sustenance and covering, let us therewith be content. Okay, wait a minute. That means that the car and the house with several rooms and a refrigerator full of food, all of these things are way, way, way beyond what it would take for us to be content if we take this as our definition. You see? If you have a place that covers your head, if you have clothing that will protect you from the elements, and if you have enough food to eat to keep you alive. He says that's what God says he'll make sure that he has. Going back to Paul's financial plan, you recognize that when God supplied that, he was able to put the rest of the money aside for when the other wouldn't come in. Do I have covering? Do I have sustenance? And in many cases, he was supplying it for his team as well. And when that happened, then he was able to meet those needs, but the rest of it was squirreled away someplace, somehow. Having food and raiment. God calls us then to recognize what is it that you need, and stop talking about need when you're really talking about the things that you would want, the things that you would desire, you see. So we see God's promise. God says, I'll be the one taking care of that. Then we see God's shared love. How will he meet those needs? He's done it in a number of different ways. I'll be outlining that for you in a moment. But I want you to see that this was God's plan. God's shared love, somehow someone will share with you and meet your needs, because God's promised that he'd take care of that. So he can direct anybody to do anything. We go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6. This was directed by God. Here's an entire passage where Jesus is preaching, and he's kind of admonishing his people for being so worldly minded, so focused on getting stuff and worrying about it. So he says this, therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life. He's talking about you controlling your life. This is not for you to worry about. What you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor yet for your body what you shall put on. What is he talking about? Sustenance and covering, you see. Is not the life more than the meat, and the body than raiment? The life is more than that, you see. Then he says, behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap. You don't see them sowing the seed, coming in with the reaping, nor do they gather into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Then he asked this question, are ye not much better than they? And he's really talking about this from God's point of view. God created man in his image, not the birds. Then he says, which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Now he says, he said we were looking at the birds earlier, consider the lilies of the field. You like lilies? Aren't they pretty? Delicate, lovely. He says, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin. He says, you don't see them sitting down at the spinning wheel, making thread, taking the thread, weaving it into cloth. You don't see them pounding on the leather, making their shoes. Yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory, King Solomon, during whose reign gold was so prevalent that silver was, it's just silver, throw that away. Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. The beauty of these flowers created, developed, designed by God. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore, he goes back to his original thought. Take no thought, saying, what shall we eat? Oh, no, see. Or what shall we drink? Or wherewithal shall we be clothed? For after all these things do the Gentiles seek. And by Gentiles here, he's talking about the people who don't know God and therefore are not believers in God. He says, that's all they're about. Scraping, putting together. For your heavenly Father knoweth that you have need of all these things. And the implication is because he loves you more than birds, even more than flowers, that he'll take care of you. See? So this is the way Christ explained this thing to his disciples of the day. So at the beginning of Christianity, this was a settled understanding. Let me take the time to just review through all of the Bible, and those of you who know your Bible best, I won't have to go into this much deeper. How often God supplied the needs of his people directly. God provided food and drink for Israel for 40 years in the wilderness. Deuteronomy 2:7, he reminds them of that now that the 40 years were ended. Water out of a rock. Bread forming just as the dew would evaporate. Bread would form. They could take it, eat it. They could let it dry, grind it, and make bread out of it. Wind swept in birds about knee deep. Bird. You could take them all and eat as much as they wanted. Ravens and a poor widow fed Elijah in the time of famine. Ravens found something and picked it up and brought it to him. An angel gave Elijah baked bread and a cruse of water in the wilderness. I've often wondered, did the angel bake the bread? Did the angel visit some baker and said, I have somebody that's really hungry. Could I have that bread? Yeah, sure, take it. I don't know. The work of creation was finished in the first 6 days. So I don't think he snapped his finger and there was baked bread there. Somehow it came about. But the angel just had it there. He woke him up, said eat, he ate, and he went back to sleep. He was traveling. Providing water for the armies of the 3 kings to conquer Moab. The water that welled up, they were very thirsty, traveling as they had. And then the pools of water looked like blood in the morning. And the enemy thought that Israel had been attacking themselves, and so they went after them. Let's go after them. And Israel just said, yeah, come on. And they defeated them there. Supply of oil for the helpful widow, remember? Gather all the pots and pans you can. She gathered a bunch, and from the little container that contained her oil, she started pouring, and she filled up all of the pots from that one little container. The food stores from the slain enemies for Samaria under siege. siege was a horrible time where they couldn't go in and out of the city, and finally they'd eaten up all their stores, and the most depraved people had begun to eat their children. Some lepers were outside, and they said, well, we're going to die anyway. Let's go to the enemy and plead. We'll join your side, lepers as we are. They got there, found they were all dead. God had killed them all that night. And so they're sitting there stuffing themselves on the stores of goods for the warriors. And they said, well, we need to tell the city. Something bad's going to happen to us if we keep this to ourselves. So they told them, and amazing provision. And we come to the New Testament, and we have, of course, the feeding of the 5,000 men, plus women and children. In Matthew 14, later he would feed the 4,000 as well. And this just miraculous multiplication of bread and fish. Now, this was when God was doing this rather directly, you see. But God often supplied the needs of his people by other saints. In Luke 6:38, Christ is explaining to us about giving. And he said, I want you to have a certain attitude about your giving. Give, and it shall be given unto you. So this is you, a human, giving. The implication seems to be that God would also give, but sometimes that giving is through other believers. It shall be given to you. Good measure is where you take that cup and you scoop it up, good measure, then pressed down, shaken together, and still running over. So this is even more than the cup was looking for. Shall men give into your bosom. This is God's plan, see, to share, loving one for another, is that they can share when they have more than absolutely necessary, they can share with you. For with the same measure that you measure out, withal it shall be measured to you again. So he's saying if you take a stingy bit, I guess I can spare this much. Well, then when you are in need, they'll say, I think I can only spare this much. It comes back to you that way. So learn to be grand-hearted. Then in 2 Corinthians 9:12, the apostle is gathering together an offering for the Jewish people in Jerusalem, who were the Jewish Christians, who were going through a time of famine. And he explains to them about this gift that they're putting together. He says, for the administration, the ministry of this service, not only supplieth the want of the saints. It will do that, but there's more to it. It is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God. And here is the joy of giving, the joy that we have of supporting the missionaries. This is where we can do these things, but then we look back to say, oh, this is wonderful, because these people have given great thanks to God through us, and all we have to do is to give. Now, Paul becomes quite specific in what he's talking about, because first of all, he talks about the matter of food, and then he goes on into the more physical things, like the matter of covering. But he says, I've been instructed, I've been initiated into the secret to be full, and it speaks specifically of being well fed. He says, I've enjoyed a good full meal. I know what that's like. But he says, I've also been instructed to be hungry. And it comes from the word for poor. And looking up the synonyms in the Greek language, this is the poor that is specifically a poor man who earns his bread by daily labor, rather than the man who's so poor he must beg for food. Paul says, I've never had to beg for food, really. God supplies it by my own labor, because he worked making tents, and they were a needed commodity in his day. So he says, there are times when I don't have everything I'd like to eat. And he says, then God's given me this great opportunity to learn special spiritual things by fasting. But other times I can be full, and I've learned to deal with both. Then the matter of covering, he says, I've learned to abound. This speaks of having more than he needs. See? and then to suffer need, and this speaks of having less than he needs. He says both. I've learned how to handle both. This phrase, to suffer need, I was interested to trace it through the Scripture. A couple of places I thought were instructive. One is, this is used of the suffering of the prodigal son. Luke 15:14, Jesus is telling the story. When he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want, meaning he didn't have everything that he needed. It's used of the suffering of the Old Testament believers. Hebrews 11:37. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were put into logs, and the logs were cut in half. They were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, otherwise all their clothes were gone. And then being destitute, that's our word, being in want, having a lack of necessary items, afflicted and tormented. We see Paul use the word as an example of his need when it was met providentially. 2 Corinthians 11:9, he says, when I was present with you and wanted, when I got there at your place and I didn't have everything I needed, he says, I'll tell you what I did. I was chargeable to no man. I didn't go begging. I didn't go demanding. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and will keep myself. He says, at that time the people from Macedonia sent me a gift, and so it took care of me. God provided when I was in need. This is then the lesson of contentment. And I urge that upon us, we who live in such a lap of luxury, literally. I remember reading of the saints in Soviet Russia who were praying for us. And they pictured us as being laden down with great lengths of golden chain. They had, literally nothing. Many of them were in prison. But they had nothing and were restricted from having things. But we had everything and couldn't lift a finger to help things, because we were all covered with chains of gold. Let's be initiated into this secret thing, that God is taking care of us. And so we are to handle ourselves in such a way that we don't use up everything that comes in. So we save it for the harder times. Well, that's part one of his strength. Part two is just really as amazing, and that is his confidence. Here's a man who doesn't always have what he needs, but he has all the confidence in the world. Listen to his statement, verse 13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. People have jumped on this to take those first few words. I can do all things. And they make a mess of this verse. I wanted to share with you Young's literal translation, because that's not the real focus if you look at the original language. He says, for all things I have strength. You see, that's a little different from I can do all things. For all the things that I set to do, I have strength in Christ's strengthening me. He says there is an empowerment given by Christ that gives me the strength for everything I need to do. This is the focus of this verse. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, I love my friend, the man I go to preach to me, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And He had a message on this, and I wanted to share much of that message with you tonight, but I had to, he used a lot of words, so I summarized it down. But he began by saying, the former part of this sentence, I can do all things, would be a piece of impudent daring without the latter part to interpret it. There have been some men who, puffed up with vanity, have said in their hearts said, I can do all things. And then he says, their destruction has been sure and near at hand. This reminded me of Shelley's wise poem, Ozymandias. I've shared this with you before. Let me take you through it. Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. He tells a story. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Can you imagine that? You have these, a pedestal and feet and legs going up, and then nothing's left. There's no body. It's trunkless. So it stands in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage. The head of that statue lays half covered in the sand, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these, the stone, the lifeless things. He said, I can read in that face the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So a sneering command on the face of this fallen head. And then he says, I came up a little closer and I looked at the pedestal. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. At this point, what he was saying is, because at that time, when that was erected, all around was this huge city, monuments, I don't know, towers, fountains, who knows? And he says, you thought you were mighty? I'm telling you, I am the King of Kings. When you look at what I've built, you'll say, well, then I don't stand a chance. Look on my mighty works and despair. But the words take on a very special meaning now, because this traveler in an antique land says, nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. His words take on a new meaning. Oh, you mighty who think you're building your kingdom right now. Look what happened to Ozymandias. He thought he was at the pinnacle of human power. Look on my works. Yeah, well, they're long gone, sorry. So, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. I want you to notice from Spurgeon's outline the measure of it. He says, it is exceeding broad, for it says I can do all things. We cannot, of course, mention all things. Time would be completely limited to that this morning. For the subject is illimitable in its extent. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. So let me share with you 9 things that he mentioned, without preaching them, just to tell you. He says this means that you can endure all trials, all testings that you face. You say every single one? Yes, all things. 2, perform all duties. What if I'm given a job that I don't think I can do? You can do it when you're enabled by Christ. 3, conquer struggles with his corruptions. What if I have internally corruptions that I'm struggling with? You can do all things through Christ. Conquer a violent temper. Right? Who has the violent temper? See? How about on the other side? Conquer timid weakness. I can't do anything. I'm too afraid. You can do all things. Overcome natural slothfulness. Spurgeon says, I don't think there's anybody in the world more naturally slothful than me. And yet, he became one of the busiest people in the world, and especially as a preacher, because he could do all things to Christ. He says, I can conquer inconsistency. I've tried and failed. I wasn't consistent in it. But you can be. You can be. Serve God in every condition. And this actually reflects back on what Paul was just saying. Good times, bad times. Easy times, hard times. Whatever the condition is, you can serve God. And then perhaps the toughest one of all, number 9, called to sudden changes. Yeah, pretty tough. Everything settled, everything going well, and then things change. When he comes to the second point, not the measure of it, but the manner of it, I think Spurgeon's mind went to what he would consider to be the hardest challenge of all, and that would be to stand trial and be sentenced to death for your Christian testimony. So let me just share with you what he shared with his readers in this message. On May 25th, 1555, John Ardley was brought before Roman Catholic Bishop Bonner. Bonner taunted him, saying, "You will not be able to bear the fire. That will convert you." They were Protestants being burned because they weren't Roman Catholics anymore. And he says, the fire will convert you. The faggots, that's the pieces of wood that burn, will be sharp preachers to you. Ardley said back to him, I'm not afraid to try it. And I tell thee, Bishop, if I had as many lives as I have hairs on my head, I would give them all up sooner than I would give up Christ. How did he have that strength? I can do all things through Christ. Bishop Bonner held the hand of poor John Tompkins over a candle, finger by finger, saying to him, I give thee a taste of the fire before thou shalt come there. And as the finger cracked and spurted forth, Tompkins smiled and even laughed in his tormentor's face, being ready to suffer as much in every member as his fingers then endured. Such power. St. Jerome, who translated the Bible into the Latin language, the language of the people of the time, tells the story of a poor Christian woman who, being on the rack, that's where your ankles and your wrists are tied, and then they began cranking a ratcheted thing that would stretch you out bit by bit and pull your joints apart. She was being on the rack. She cried out to her tormentors as they straightened the rack and pulled her bones asunder, Do your worst, for I would sooner die than lie. And he says it was bravely said. Old Ignatius is brought into the Roman circus after facing the taunts of the emperor and the jeers of the multitude. The lions were let loose upon him, and he thrust his arm into the lion's mouth, poor aged man that he is. And when the bones were cracking, he said, Now I begin to be a Christian. Wow. Such strength. Gordus said when they were putting him to death, I pray you do not spare any torments, for it will be a loss to me hereafter if you do. Therefore inflict as many as you can. Powerful words. When persecution broke out in Luther's day, as the Reformation came and people were pulling away from Catholicism, John and Henry, two Augustine monks who had been converted, the first who were put to death for Christ in Germany, died singing. Mr. Rogers, no, not that Mr. Rogers, was first put to death in England for Christ, and he died singing too. When good John Noyes was about to be burned, he took up a faggot and kissed it and said, Blessed be God that he has thought me worthy of such high honor as this. Where do men get this strength? I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. Roland Taylor began to dance when he came to the flames for the high honor of suffering for Christ, mocking their torment. And he closes with this: Jane Bouchier, our glorious Baptist martyr. This was a woman who was burned at the stake by Protestants for being a Baptist. Understand that we've never been well liked. Let's just say that. The Maid of Kent, when she was brought before Cranmer and Ridley, was able to confound them entirely. Her answers were so strong, so biblical, that they had nothing to say back to her. Then she said, I am as true a servant of Christ as any of you, and if you put your poor sister to death, take care lest God should let loose the wolf of Rome, Roman Catholics, on you, and you have to suffer for God too. I did some research after he said that. They burned her in 1550. Only 5 years later, Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, burned them both at the stake. Ridley on October 16th with a bag of gunpowder hung around his neck, and Cranmer on March 21st, 1555. They understood what horrible injustice they had turned out. He closes then with the third point, the message of it, and I like this concept. He says, the message of it is first a message of encouragement. Do you feel that? I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. With the empowering of Christ, you are able to handle every trial, every test. You can do that. Secondly, it's a message of warning. Get Christ's strength, for you can do nothing without it. Christ said, without me, you can do nothing. You see? So with that strength, you can do anything. Without it, nothing. And then a message of duty. How is it that some of you are doing nothing when you can do all things through Christ? And then he closed, as I do, with a quote from an old author named Stuckley. Now, Spurgeon was 100 years ago, and he called this an old author, so I don't know how old this man was. Here's what Stuckley said. He seems like a crusty old preacher. There were some professed Christians who were not as good as Balaam's ass, Balaam's donkey. For Balaam's ass once rebuked the mad prophet for his sin. But there were some Christians who never rebuked anyone all their lives long. They let sin go on under their very eyes, and yet they did not point to it. They saw sinners dropping into hell, and they stretched not out their hands to pluck them as brands from the burning. They walked in the midst of the blind, but they would not lead them. They stood in the midst of the deaf, but they would not hear for them. They were where misery was rife, was full, but their mercy would not work upon the misery. They were sent to be saviors of men, but by their negligence they became men's destroyers. Am I my brother's keeper was the language of Cain. Cain hath many children even at this day. Ye are your brother's keeper. If you have grace in your heart, you are called to do good to others. Take care, lest your garments be stained and sprinkled with the blood of your fellow men. Mind, Christians, mind, lest that village in which you have found a quiet retreat from the cares of business should rise up in judgment against you to condemn you, because having means and opportunity, you use the village for rest, but never seek to do any good in it. Take care, masters and mistresses, general for people to have servants in those days, and we sometimes have in business people that we order about, lest your servants' souls be required of you at the last day. He imagines the servant testifying to God, I worked for my master, he paid me my wages, but he had no respect to his greater master and never spoke to me, though he heard me swear and saw me going on in my sins. Is this how we live our lives? When perhaps we learn contentment, but we haven't learned the confidence that you can have in God. For in him, empowered by him, you can do all things. Let's pray. Father, we turn to thee then with this awakening of our thinking, that when we, like the Apostle Paul, can hold with one hand the contentment to have enough food to eat and enough clothes to put on, and not grasp for more than that, or to set that aside for harder times, and to provide for others. If we grasp that with one hand, and on the other, the confidence that we can do literally all things as Christ gives us the strength, then, Father, we understand we could do whatever in this life. We can go anywhere. We can accomplish whatever you want us to do, because our needs will be less and our confidence will be utmost. With heads bowed, eyes closed, it may be you're saying, I don't think I have either of those, Pastor. I find I kind of gripe that I don't have more than I have now. And yet, even as I look at what I have food to eat, and I have a covering on my body and on my head, and I have much more than that. Help me to learn to be content. And then, perhaps my timidness stands in great stark contrast to the idea that I can do all things in Christ. Help me to trust God in this, to venture forth, to believe, and to act, letting God take care of that. If these are your prayers, I wonder if you'd slip your hand up, say, pray for me. Let me be strengthened to live with contentment and with great confidence. Pray for me. Father, then we bow unto thee, recognizing that we have often learned to be spoiled and to want just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, where we need to learn to be content so our financial understanding will be reckoned as proper. And then we recognize it's merely an excuse to say that I can't, for with you all things are possible. I pray that you might strengthen us then for both contentment and confidence, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.